Welcome back everybody to the second episode of my plugin development tutorials, and today we are going to be learning about two more Java concepts while working towards the end goal of being able to create commands inside our Bucket plugin. Now the two concepts that are very important in Java that are key to anything you do that I'm going to be teaching you about is objects. We discussed those yesterday, so make sure you've seen that episode, but we're going to go into more detail and actually make our first ever object that we're going to be manipulating. We're going to be adjusting the static variables, the static assets, the static attributes inside that, and then we're going to be using that to modify the dynamic behavior inside each method of our class. We're also going to be learning a little bit more about constructors and what constructors are, because from what I know, you don't know anything just yet about what constructors are, so I'm going to make sure we cover that in today's tutorial. So the first thing that we want to do is add our command into our plugin.yml file. When using Bucket, everything has to go in here. Bucket knows nothing about your plugin, so whatever you want to tell it about your plugin, you need to put inside your plugin.yml file. If I click over here, you can see that we have exactly what we had yesterday. Inside the main plugin class, I've just removed the comments and any scripting because we're not going to be using that today. So I'm simply going to go into the plugin.yml and I'm going to add in this command section. Now the way in which we do this is we double tap enter. You don't have to do that, but like I say, I like to keep everything formatted. YML is case sensitive and it is also space sensitive, which isn't like Java. I forgot to say this last episode, but something interesting about Java, you can have as many spaces as you like. I could add lots of spaces here, and this is still a perfectly valid Java plugin. I could even put this on the next line. Java doesn't care about spacing, and it doesn't care about lines. Java, you could have the entire of an operating system running on just one line. Java really does not mind. Of course, we're going to get rid of that now. So, how exactly do we approach this problem? We want to create a command inside our plugin. We'll begin by telling Bucket about it. So we actually create a section of our plugin.yml which is called commands. Let's create that. Now in YML files, each subpart of our YML file is specified with 2 spaces, so we'll type 2 spaces. Now this means to access anything that comes after this, we'll have to type commands as the parent, dot something else, and that's called the child. So for example, we'll give our command a name. We're going to call our command ride. You'll see exactly why that is later in today, because we're going to be making a plugin where you can ride any mob from inside the game. Now in order to do this, we also have to specify a few more things. The only thing I usually specify is the usage, so just hit enter again. Usage is a child of the ride parent, so 2 spaces again, and then we type the usage keyword. Plugin.yml files are just a YML file, and YML files are used for other things like configuration files, so it's very useful learning this formatting and these rules, so make sure you pick up on them. As for usage, this simply tells us how we would use the command, so in our case it's just /ride. We've now specified our commands inside our plugin.yml file. So how exactly do we go about initializing this? Well, I said we'd make an object, so we're going to do that. We're going to right click inside our package. Remember, that's like a container where we store all of our objects. And we're going to create a new object. It's going to be a type Java class, and we're going to call this object ride command. Now I could create a command for each sort of animal, but that would take a long time, and it'd be a very bad way of doing it, because if we had a different command file for every single animal and we're only changing one word inside each class, doesn't that seem a bit silly? So what we can actually do is create our ride command object, and what we can do is say whenever we create a ride command object, we want to find out what animal we want to use. So the way in which we're going to do this, we're going to enter inside the class, and we're going to specify a variable. Now a variable is simply a key and a value. Of course it does at the start require that we put what type of value it is, so our type is entity. All mobs and item frames and anything like that is called an entity in Bucket, and as you can see this is in the org.bucket.entity container. Now we know that it's of type entity, but what are we going to refer it to? Because we might have multiple entities and want to refer to them differently, so we now put a name and identifier. Now the common convention for this is to use something called by programmers lower camel case. What this is a lowercase letter at the start of your first word and then an uppercase letter at the start of every other word. You can see over here when we have the name ride command and plugin, we're using upper camel case because we have a capital letter at the start of every word, we have no spaces, but the first letter is an uppercase, so we call it upper camel case. We name variables with lower camel case. That's just a convention, as I was saying before. So we're actually going to call this entity type. So to do this, we simply hit space, and the next part of our variable is the identifier, entity type. Now what we want to do is set this equal to something. Now we could set it equal to something just like this, but this would keep it static and we'd never be able to change it. So what we're actually going to do is go back a few spaces and put a semicolon. Remember, a semicolon ends everything. Now currently this entity type is null. There is no way of dealing with it, and also we're just using an entity. An entity is one specific entity. All we want to store is the type. So what we actually change this to is entity type. And because entity type is a container, just like our ride command and our plugin, it's named in upper camel case. We can also get rid of this import because this import is no longer needed. This is just cleaning up our code. Now what we need to do to finish off is create a constructor. Our constructor is going to set this value, which is currently null. That means it has no value and it can't be used, to something. Now what we can do to do this is set a name, a public. This is our access. Anybody can create a ride command. If this was private, then not everybody would be able to create a ride command, or at least not in this way. And then rather than having a return type like void, like we do in our other methods, we don't need one here because this is a constructor, and we're always going to give back an instance of ride command, a specific instance of this object, a specific item. So there's no point to specify what we give back because we know what we're going to give back. So now all we have to do is specify the name, and we just call this ride command. Now what we want to do is our brackets as before. And remember how I said you can put something inside the brackets that you want the plugin to take as an argument, that you want to require to run this method. This is just a method, just with the void command missing. And we're going to require an entity type. And we're going to call this entity type again. And now we're going to make some curly braces because that's needed for every method. Now we could type entity type equals entity type, but since entity type is already specified here, we'd just be setting entity type here to entity type here. So to specify that we don't want this entity type and we want the entity type inside our class, we use the this keyword. The this keyword always accesses the class that you are in, the object that you are in. So we'll go this.entity type and we'll set this equal to entity type. So what we're doing is saying go inside our class, get entity type, and set it equal to the entity type that's more local, the entity type that's inside our method. So now every time we create a ride command, we can also specify the entity type. Now we want to make this a command, and remember, just like here we typed extends Java plugin, we can also use something called implements. Implements means that rather than giving us methods like the getLogger method we had before, it just tells us what methods we need. It's more like instructions. So we can actually use the implements command executor. By doing this, we need an import, so we just hit Alt and Enter, and we then push the implement methods key and then select OK. What this has done is it said, well, anybody that's using this instructions file, this recipe, always requires the onCommand method, so it creates it for us. And as you can see, we're overriding this, we're taking it from these instructions, we're overriding those instructions and making our own method, and we are making a boolean. This means it either returns true or false, depending on whether it succeeded or failed. We'll always return true because this command is hopefully never going to fail. Of course, in more complex operations, you could type return false, and what this would do is simply type /ride in the chat to show you that you're not using the command correctly. Now, as you can see, this takes certain things. It takes the command sender, the command, the string, and the strings. Now, since command sender is just an instance of something, it's an instance of the class and it's not an actual type of class, what we need to do is see if our command sender is of type player. So to do this, we're going to use an if statement. We're going to go on to the next line and we're going to type the if keyword. This is followed by a boolean value. Now we can use the equals equals operator. So if command sender is an instance of, and then the keyword player. Notice how player isn't any specific player, it is just one thing. It is just a player. It is just a definition of how a player would appear. It's just one of our boxes. It's not the contents. So if our command sensor is a box which contains a player, so any player, then we want to do something, and again we use curly braces to specify it's inside here. So if our command sender is an instance of a player, what we're going to do is spawn this entity at their location. So to do this, we go into the command sender. As you can see, we get certain methods, but we don't get the methods we want. We can't get their location. And the reason that we can't get this is because they're currently a command sender and not a player. In order to get the player, we need to tell Bucket that we know that this is a player. So we use something called casting. What we do to cast is we type what we want it to be. We give it a reference name, just like we did up here. We'll call this player. And we'll set this equal to command sender. You'll notice that this gives us an error, and the reason is, as you can see, because it requires a player, but we've given it a command sender. So to say actually this is definitely a player, we need to tell it that. So we put brackets, and inside the brackets we put what we know it is, which is player. So now we're setting the command sender equal to player, and we now have the player variable, and which player is a player. Now we can spawn the entity type at their location. We're actually going to make this into a variable because we want to be able to access this later so that we can make the player ride it. So to do this, we do the following. We get the player's location. Actually, before we do that, we need to specify our variable, so that's entity. Notice how rather than using entity type, I'm using entity because we're not having a container this time. We're actually having the contents. And inside entity, we're having the name for that entity, and the name for this entity, we're just going to call entity. I'm going to set this equal to player dot get location dot get world dot spawn entity, and you see that this spawns an entity. We're going to spawn this entity at player.getLocation. Notice how this takes a location argument and an entity type argument. So we begin by specifying the location, we then put a comma, and we now specify the type. Now I could simply type an entity type, for example, entity type.bat. But by doing this, we make ourselves non-dynamic, and we'd have to change this every time we wanted to change this. So instead, we're just going to set this equal to entity type. Now what this is going to do is every time a player types the command, it will spawn the entity type that we chose in the constructor. So everybody that makes a ride command has to say, what ride command would you like? What mob would you like it to spawn? And it will then spawn the entity type. Now we want the player to start riding the entity type, so that's also really simple. Bucket has a method for that. Something inside one of its packages, inside one of its class objects, that tells us how we can make something ride an entity. All we have to do is go entity. All we have to do is go entity dot set passenger. So set a passenger of this entity and player. Now you notice that this requires an entity, and we've given it a player, and you're wondering why that works. Well, that's because a player extends an entity. Bucket actually tells it, just like here, we say that a plugin is like a Java plugin, and we could set a Java plugin equal to this. Here, Bucket says, actually, we're extending entity. Players are just a type of entity, so it's fine. They can still ride it. They're just a more specific version. They can still do everything an entity can do. So now every time we type our command, this is going to work. But Bucket doesn't know about this ride command method, so we have to tell it in our plugin, in fact in our onEnable. To do this, we go to a new line. Bucket.getPlugin command and the name. In this case, this is ride. And then we .set executor. We tell it what plugin executor we want to use. Now you can see that this uses a command executor and not a ride command, but we can still set this equal to a new ride command. And then now we're done. You can see that this works because here we are implementing command executor, and here we are using an executor, and it knows that I didn't want a ride command, but a ride command is just another type of an executor, so I'm not too bothered. Now notice how we've got a red line here. It's saying, I'm actually expecting you to tell me what entity type I want to use. Brilliant. What we've done is told it that every time someone creates a ride command, they need to specify an entity. So inside here we can simply type the entity we want to use. We'll use bat. And that is literally it. You've now created your first command in Bucket. Now what if we want to tell them a message? What if we want to send them a message and say, you know, you're now riding a bat? We can go into our ride command method and we can simply type it here. We can go onto a new line and we can go player dot send message. And inside here you see how it takes a string, so our string can be success. Somebody asked me in my last episode what I could do to success, and we can actually give it a colour. To do this we use the chat colour method. Note that this uses the American spelling because programmers generally follow American conventions while using Java. We can use chatColor.anyColor, and in this case I'm going to use chatColor.green. We'll then use a plus, which tells Bucket that we want to add both of these arguments together into our final argument. So it's saying get whatever chatColor.green is, get whatever success is, merge the two together, and that is what we want to send the player. So now every time a player runs the command, it's going to go to their location, it's going to spawn an entity at their location, it's going to be of the entity type that we use in the constructor, and then it's going to set them as a passenger, and it's going to send them a message that says success. To finish off this episode, I'd like to tell you about the else statement. After the end curly brace of any if statement, you can write the keyword else. You can then put another set of curly braces and write whatever you like. In this case, we're going to send a failure message to the command sender, because if the command isn't a player, if the command wasn't sent by a player, we want to do the following. So now, if the command sender is a player, it will say success and make them ride the animal of their choice. If it's not, then it will simply say failure. Now, we'll also learn more in the future about how to use arguments in our commands. In fact, this is quite easy. You'll see that if we type, for example, /ride space pigeon, we'd be able to get the pigeon argument by using this string array. All you have to do is the following. Note how it starts at 0 rather than 1. Like, see, if this isn't a statement, so this wouldn't work, but say for example we wanted to send them a message with whatever argument they used, we could simply do the following. So what we're actually doing is we're appending strings to 0. Now it starts at 0, that's just a convention in Java. Apologies for that, you just need to know that. So what we're doing is we're appending their argument. If there is a string 0, you probably want to check the size before using another if statement and seeing if strings.size is greater than 1 using the greater than operator. But to be honest, we'll get to that in the future. But you can see how really easily we've made our first ever command inside Bucket. And that's the end of our second plugin tutorial. There will of course be a link down below to my website where you can find all the source code for this episode, and you can ask any questions and find tips from things that people have been struggling with. But I've got no more to say, so thanks for watching everybody. I've been Oliver vs Creeper, but for now, good night.